The Amazon rainforest, often referred to as the lungs of the earth, is not only home to rich biodiversity, but also some of the last uncontacted and isolated indigenous tribes on the planet. These tribes, having chosen to remain apart from modern civilization, depend entirely on the preservation of their land and traditional ways for survival. And while South American nations like Brazil, Peru, and Ecuador have taken steps to protect these tribes, growing threats from deforestation, illegal mining, and climate change raise serious concerns. And looking at today's question, are these countries doing enough to protect isolated peoples and tribes? The answer is they're trying, but no. To do this, we have to look at 3 points: the environmental destruction caused by deforestation, the weak legal enforcement of indigenous territories, and lack of resources for indigenous protection agencies. So first, looking at the destruction of Amazon rainforest through deforestation, this would serve as the greatest threat to isolated tribes, and the Amazon serves as a critical buffer that shields these groups from the dangers of the outside world. But illegal logging, agricultural expansion, and infrastructure progress are eroding this natural barrier. And in 2022 alone, a report from Brazil's national protection agencies show that the Amazon lost nearly 10,000 square kilometers of forest cover, an area the size of Lebanon. And this is also reinforced by the World Resources Institute. Brazil, which houses 60% of the Amazon, saw a particularly sharp increase in deforestation during the presidency of Jair Bolsonaro, with deforestation rates rising by almost 22% in 2021 compared to the previous year from that National Protection Agency's report. And this loss of habitat not only threatens biodiversity of the region, but also forces isolated tribes into closer contact with outsiders, which increases the likelihood of violent encounters, disease transmission, and displacement. So, second, the legal protections that do exist for indigenous territories are inadequately enforced. So, many South American countries have established indigenous reserves like Brazil's Yanomami indigenous territory to protect isolated tribes. However, these tribes do not have proper enforcement of their own rules, and protection remains weak, particularly in the face of illegal logging and mining activities. And in 2023, more than 20,000 illegal miners were reported to be operating within the Yanomami Reserve, which is devastating local ecosystems and causing serious harm to the indigenous population. And this includes the spread of malaria, and in Peru, where nearly 70% of the Amazon is covered by oil and gas concessions, all these territories overlap, or many of these territories overlap with those indigenous peoples. And despite legal provisions, we can see that weak government oversight allows these activities to continue. So, third and finally, the lack of adequate funding and resources for indigenous protection agencies hampers the efforts to safeguard them. So, economic challenges and political instability in many South American countries divert attention and resources away from indigenous protection. Brazil's National Indian Foundation, or FUNAI, for instance, has seen its budget slashed by 40% in recent years, significantly limiting its ability to patrol indigenous territories and protect from illegal activities. So similarly, Peru's government has struggled to allocate funds in doing this and resources, looking at the face of encroachment of logging, mining, and these oil companies that were aforementioned. And without adequate funding, government agencies are unable to effectively monitor and protect these regions, which leave isolated tribes vulnerable to this violent and dangerous exploitation. So, in addition to these domestic challenges, we can actually see that there's international efforts to protect isolated tribes, and they've fallen short. So, while the United Nations adopted the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, many South Americans have yet to fully implement its principles, particularly when it comes to isolated tribes. And this global community must hold these countries accountable for their obligations. And the international organizations like Rainforest Foundation and Amazon Watch have been instrumental in drawing attention to the plight of isolated tribes, but their efforts are not enough. Stronger international pressure and collaboration are needed to ensure that the rights of those vulnerable communities are actually upheld. And moreover, the increasing effects of climate change actually exacerbate these threats from facing the isolated tribes. So we can see that rising temperatures, shifting weather patterns, and more frequent natural disasters are actually altering these ecosystems more rapidly than we think, on which these deprived tribes depend. So, according to a report by the United Nations Environmental Program, or UNEP, this climate change actually poses such an existential threat to these existing groups that we can see that it's disrupting their integral life sources like food, water, and forcing them to move out of their familiar area and into dangerous territory. And this intersection of environmental destruction as well as climate change makes it even more critical for South American nations to ramp these efforts up to protect both the Amazon and its indigenous inhabitants. So, looking back at today's question, South American nations are not doing enough to protect isolated peoples and tribes. The combined efforts of rampant deforestation, weak legal enforcement, and insufficient resources for protection agencies have left these communities increasingly vulnerable. And while there have been some efforts to establish protected areas and reserves, we can see that these measures are undermined by illegal activities and lack of political will. So governments in South America must strengthen their own commitment to to protecting isolated tribes by providing greater resources, enforcing existing laws, and prioritizing the rights of indigenous peoples over short-term economic interests. And the survival of these tribes is intertwined with the health of the Amazon rainforest, and failure to protect them would represent not only a human tragedy, but also an environmental disaster for the entire planet. Thank you.